There is a ship so large that it has its own zip code, longer than the Empire State Building is tall, carrying 90 combat aircraft, more than most countries own in their entire air force. Its 2 nuclear reactors power a city of 100,000 people for over 20 years without refueling. It produces 400,000 gallons of fresh water daily from the ocean. It has its own hospital, its own television station, its own fire department, and its own court system, all moving through open ocean at speeds physics says should be impossible. The USS Abraham Lincoln is not just a warship. It is a floating sovereign nation, a 100,000-ton steel city that moves at 35 miles per hour through open ocean, projects military power across entire continents, and costs $12 billion to build, not counting the aircraft, not counting the weapons, not counting the nuclear reactors that power it essentially forever without refueling. When Abraham Lincoln enters a region, wars that were about to start suddenly don't. Governments that were making threats go quiet. Leaders who are feeling bold begin making phone calls, not because anyone ordered them to, but because when you look at the intelligence reports and see that carrier group on the horizon, 7,500 sailors, 90 aircraft, and enough firepower to end a conflict before breakfast, the calculation changes completely. Every navy on Earth wants one. Only one country has 11. This is the USS Abraham Lincoln, and the story of what it actually is, what it actually does, and why nothing else on Earth comes close, starts with a problem nobody expected to survive. The problem that demanded a floating airbase. In 1921, American general named Billy Mitchell walked into the United States Navy's headquarters and made a claim so outrageous that senior admirals laughed him out of the room. He said he could sink a battleship using nothing but airplanes, not torpedo boats, not submarines, not other warships, airplanes. The fragile canvas and wood flying machines that most military commanders still considered glorified observation tools. Mitchell claimed he could take a fleet of bombers, fly them over a warship, and send it to the bottom of the ocean. The Navy agreed to let him try, mostly because they were absolutely certain he would fail. They anchored a captured German battleship called the Ostfriesland in the Atlantic Ocean off the Virginia coast. They invited journalists, politicians, and senior military officials to watch from a safe distance. They wanted witnesses for the moment this arrogant general was proven wrong in public. What happened next changed warfare forever. Mitchell's bombers sank the Ostfriesland in 21 minutes. Not damaged it, not compromised it. Sent 27,000 tons of German steel to the bottom of the Atlantic Ocean in less time than it takes to watch a sitcom. The admirals watching from the observation ships went completely silent. Some accounts describe senior naval officers openly weeping because in 21 minutes, Billy Mitchell had just made their entire fleet, their battleships, their cruisers, everything they had, built their careers and their strategic doctrine around, potentially obsolete. The Navy's response was extraordinary in its stubbornness. They court-martialed Mitchell 2 years later for insubordination when he kept publicly criticizing their refusal to take air power seriously. He was convicted, he resigned, and the Navy went right back to building battleships. Then came December 7th, 1941. Pearl Harbor didn't just kill 2,403 Americans. It proved, in the most devastating way imaginable, that Billy Mitchell had been right about everything. The entire Pacific Fleet battleship force was crippled in a single morning, not by enemy warships, not by submarines, but by aircraft launched from Japanese carriers operating 230 miles away. Ships that never saw their attackers. Ships that had no meaningful way to fight back against threats coming from the sky. In one Sunday morning, the battleship died as the dominant weapon of naval warfare. And America was left staring at the wreckage in Pearl Harbor, asking the question that would define the next century of military strategy. If battleships are finished, what wins wars now? The answer came 6 months later, in June 1942, at a small atoll in the Central Pacific called Midway. And it came in a way that even the most enthusiastic aviation advocates hadn't fully anticipated. The Battle of Midway was unlike any naval engagement in history. 2 of the most powerful fleets ever assembled fought a decisive, war-changing battle across 180 miles of open ocean, and the opposing ships never once came within sight of each other. Not a single shell was fired between surface vessels. Every attack, every decisive blow, every ship that burned and sank, all of it was delivered by aircraft launched from carriers operating beyond visual range. Japan lost 4 fleet carriers in 3 days. Their naval air power, built over a decade, trained over years, was effectively destroyed. And America, which had lost its battleships at Pearl Harbor but preserved its carriers because they happened to be at sea that morning, suddenly found itself holding the weapon that actually won naval wars. The lesson was written in fire across the Pacific. Carriers didn't support naval power. Carriers were naval power. Whoever controlled the carriers controlled the ocean, and whoever controlled the ocean controlled the outcome of the war. America absorbed this lesson with a focus that bordered on obsession. They didn't just decide to build more carriers. They decided to build carriers so large, so capable, and so powerful that no navy on Earth could ever challenge them. Carriers that were essentially floating air bases, complete military ecosystems that could project devastating air power anywhere on the globe, sustained indefinitely, without depending on friendly territory or vulnerable land bases. The Nimitz-class supercarrier was the answer that decades of that obsession eventually produced. And the USS Abraham Lincoln CVN-72 is its purest expression, the Engineering Colossus. There is a moment that every first-time visitor to the USS Abraham Lincoln describes in almost identical terms. You approach the ship from the dock. You've seen the photographs. You've read the dimensions. You think you're prepared. And then you actually stand next to it. And every number you memorize becomes completely meaningless because no number prepares you for what 1,092 feet of warship looks like from ground level. It doesn't look like a ship. It looks like a city that someone accidentally pushed into the water. Let's talk about what this machine actually is, because the engineering inside the Abraham Lincoln isn't just impressive by naval standards. It is impressive by the standards of everything humanity has ever built. Start with the basic dimensions. The Abraham Lincoln is 1,092 feet long. The Empire State Building, one of the most iconic structures ever constructed, stands 1,454 feet tall, including its antenna. Without the antenna, the building itself is 1,250 feet. The Abraham Lincoln is longer than the Empire State Building's roof height from street level. If you stood this ship on its end in downtown Manhattan, it would be one of the tallest structures in the city. The flight deck covers 4.5 acres of steel. 4.5 acres. That is larger than 3 American football fields placed side by side. It is large enough that crew members assigned to different sections of the ship can go entire deployments without crossing paths, with colleagues working on the other end of the same vessel. And all of this, every inch of steel, every system, every weapon, every aircraft, every one of the 7,500 human beings living and working inside it, is supported by a hull displacing 100,000 tons of water. To put that in terms that actually communicate the scale, the Abraham Lincoln weighs more than every car rolling off American assembly lines in a full week of production, combined. Now let's talk about what makes it move. Buried deep inside the hull, completely sealed from the outside world, are 2 Westinghouse A4W nuclear reactors. These reactors produce 260,000 shaft horsepower, enough energy to drive 4 massive propeller shafts, each one as tall as a 2-story building, pushing this 100,000-ton structure through open ocean at speeds exceeding 30 knots. That is roughly 35 miles per hour, which sounds unimpressive until you realize you are accelerating something heavier than a small mountain to highway speeds using controlled nuclear fission. Here is the detail that stops people cold. Those reactors were fueled once when the ship was built. They will not need refueling for the entire operational life of the vessel. Over 20 years of continuous operation, crossing every ocean on Earth, running every system on a floating city on a single nuclear fuel node. The Abraham Lincoln has never pulled into port because it ran out of fuel. It never will. But the reactors are almost secondary to what happens on the flight deck above, because the Abraham Lincoln doesn't just carry aircraft. It launches them in a way that should be physically impossible to watch without your brain refusing to accept what your eyes are seeing. The catapult system The C-13 steam catapult installed across the Abraham Lincoln's deck accelerates a fully loaded combat aircraft from a complete standstill to 165 miles per hour in approximately 2 seconds. 2 seconds. The pilots strapped into those cockpits experience a force of roughly 4 times the weight of gravity pressing them back into their seats during those 2 seconds. It is, by any clinical measure, the most violent controlled acceleration a human being can experience and survive with any regularity. Fighter pilots who've experienced both describe it as more physically intense than any roller coaster, any racing car, any other sensation available to human beings outside of actual combat. Their vision narrows, their bodies compress, and then suddenly they are airborne over open ocean with nothing beneath them but water. Landing is somehow worse. When an aircraft returns to the Abraham Lincoln, it is traveling at approximately 150 miles per hour. It needs to stop within 300 feet, the length of a single football field, on a moving ship, on a deck that is rising and falling with ocean swells, often at night, often in poor weather. The arresting wire system, 4 cables stretched across the flight deck, each one approximately 1,025 inches thick, catches a hook trailing behind the aircraft and absorbs the equivalent energy of stopping a 50,000-pound vehicle from highway speed in the length of your living room. The deceleration force on the pilot during a carrier trap is described by naval aviators as feeling like hitting a wall that you hit on purpose, repeatedly, as your job. Then there is the anchor chain, because even a detail as seemingly mundane as how the Abraham Lincoln stays stationary reveals engineering at a scale that defies normal comprehension. Each individual link in the anchor chain weighs 360 pounds. A single link, the full anchor chain, contains hundreds of these links, running through a chain locker the size of a small warehouse buried in the bow of the ship. And coordinating all of this, the flight operations, the reactor management, the weapon systems, the navigation, the 7,500 human beings eating and sleeping and working across this floating city is managed from the island structure rising from the starboard edge of the flight deck. 4 stories of command infrastructure, bristling with radar arrays and communications equipment, from which a small team of officers orchestrates one of the most operationally complex environments on Earth. The Abraham Lincoln is not an engineering achievement in the way that a bridge or a skyscraper is an engineering achievement. Those structures just have to stand there. The Abraham Lincoln has to think. The $12 billion price tag. What are you actually paying for? $12 billion. That is the number that gets quoted in congressional budget hearings, in newspaper headlines, in arguments about military spending. $12 billion for a single warship. And the moment most people hear that number, their reaction is completely predictable. That's insane. Nothing is worth $12 billion. Here's the problem with that reaction. It is based on a fundamental misunderstanding of what you are actually buying. Because $12 billion is not the cost of the USS Abraham Lincoln. $12 billion is merely the entry fee, the opening bid, the price of the ship before you add anything that makes it actually function as a weapon of war. Let's build the real number from the ground up. The Abraham Lincoln never operates alone. It is the centerpiece of a carrier strike group, a carefully assembled constellation of warships, submarines, and support vessels that travel with it everywhere it goes. A typical Abraham Lincoln strike group includes 2 guided missile cruisers, 2 or 3 destroyers, 1 or 2 attack submarines operating invisibly beneath the surface, and a supply ship keeping everything fed and armed indefinitely. When you add the construction and operational costs of every vessel in that strike group together, the total rises to approximately $25 billion. The carrier is less than half the cost of the weapon system it anchors. Then add the aircraft. The Abraham Lincoln carries approximately 90 combat aircraft, a mix of FA-18 Super Hornets, EA-18G Growler electronic warfare aircraft, E-2D Hawkeye early warning planes, and various helicopters. Each FA-18 Super Hornet costs roughly $70 million. The full air wing, 90 aircraft of various types, fully equipped and maintained, represents another $10 billion in hardware sitting on that flight deck. You are now at $35 billion, and the ship hasn't moved yet. Now it moves. And every single day that it operates, whether it is sailing across the Pacific, conducting flight operations in the Persian Gulf, or sitting at anchor off the coast of a crisis zone, the Abraham Lincoln costs $6.5 million to run. Not per week, per day. $6.5 million every 24 hours in fuel for the escort vessels, in aircraft maintenance, in ammunition resupply, in food for 7,500 people eating 3 meals a day, in every consumable resource required to keep this floating city operational. And it is, genuinely, a city. The Abraham Lincoln has its own hospital, not a sick bay, an actual medical facility with multiple operating theaters, dental offices, and psychiatric services. It has its own legal court system capable of conducting full military trials at sea. It broadcasts its own internal television station. It prints its own daily newspaper. It has its own post office with its own zip code, 09 CVN-72, meaning you can send a letter to a sailor on the Abraham Lincoln the same way you send a letter to someone living in Chicago or Houston. It has 4 separate dining facilities serving roughly 18,000 meals every single day. Its bakeries produce fresh bread around the clock. Its water distillation system converts raw seawater into 400,000 gallons of fresh drinking water daily, enough to supply a small town. None of this stops. None of it pauses for weekends or holidays or rough weather. The Abraham Lincoln operates continuously, 24 hours a day, every day of its deployment, which typically lasts between 6 and 9 months without returning to home port. Now, here is where the nuclear propulsion changes the entire strategic equation in a way that the price tag alone cannot capture. A conventional carrier, the kind that France operates, the kind that China is desperately trying to perfect, runs on diesel fuel. It needs refueling every few days of high-speed operation. That means it needs to find friendly ports. It needs to negotiate access with host nations. It needs tanker ships in proximity at all times. Every time it stops to refuel, it reveals its location, its schedule, and its intentions to anyone watching. The Abraham Lincoln needs none of that. Its nuclear reactors run for over 20 years on a single fuel load. 20 years of continuous operation without a single refueling stop, which means the Abraham Lincoln can go anywhere on Earth, at any speed, for any duration, without asking anyone's permission to keep moving. No port access required, no fuel negotiations, no predictable resupply schedule that an adversary can track and plan around. This is the strategic capability that $12 billion, or more precisely, $35 billion, actually purchases. Not just firepower, not just aircraft, but the ability to project overwhelming military power to any point on the globe, sustained indefinitely, completely independent of friendly territory or vulnerable supply lines. When military planners talk about American power projection, this is what they mean. The Abraham Lincoln doesn't need a base. It is the base. The Abraham Lincoln in combat and beyond. What it actually. March 19, 2003, 9:33 p.m. local time, over the Persian Gulf. The USS Abraham Lincoln hadn't fired a single weapon yet. The ground war hadn't started. Not one American soldier had crossed the Iraqi border. The world was still debating in United Nations chambers whether war was actually coming. And then the Abraham Lincoln opened its hatches and launched 40 Tomahawk cruise missiles simultaneously into the darkness. 40 missiles in a single salvo, each one carrying a 1,000-pound warhead. Each one pre-programmed with GPS coordinates accurate to within feet. Each one traveling at 550 miles per hour toward targets deep inside Iraqi territory, command bunkers, air defense installations, communication centers, leadership compounds, targets that had been selected, verified, and loaded into guidance systems weeks before the first politician finished their last speech. The war didn't start when the ground troops crossed the border. The war started when the Abraham Lincoln spoke. Everything after that was consequence. Operation Iraqi Freedom represented the Abraham Lincoln, functioning exactly as its designers intended. Not as a symbol, not as a deterrent, as a precision instrument of overwhelming force, positioned perfectly, striking without warning, from a location that required no land base, no host nation permission, no visible buildup that could be tracked and anticipated. Iraqi air defense commanders had watched the Abraham Lincoln arrive in the Gulf. They knew it was there. They had 30 days to prepare for what was coming. And when it came, there was still nothing they could do about it. Then came May 1st, 2003, and one of the most complicated moments in the Abraham Lincoln's entire history. President George W. Bush flew onto the Abraham Lincoln's flight deck in a Navy S-3B Viking aircraft, becoming the first sitting president to make a carrier-arrested landing, and delivered a speech beneath a banner reading, "Mission accomplished." The images broadcast globally that day became some of the most recognized and most debated photographs of the entire Iraq War era. Here is what was actually happening on that flight deck that almost nobody reported accurately. The Abraham Lincoln's crew had just completed the longest carrier deployment in recent American naval history. 10 months at sea, away from families, away from home, pushing the ship and every person on it to the absolute limits of operational endurance. The mission accomplished banner wasn't a political statement manufactured by the White House. It was made by the crew, for themselves, celebrating the completion of their specific mission, the combat phase of the operation. After 10 months of continuous deployment, the sailors standing on that deck weren't celebrating the end of the Iraq War. They were celebrating finally going home. The political interpretation of that moment belongs to history. What belongs to the Abraham Lincoln's crew is the 10 months of relentless, exhausting, dangerous operational service that preceded it. But combat is only part of what this ship has done. In December 2004, a magnitude 9.1 earthquake struck beneath the Indian Ocean and generated a tsunami that killed over 227,000 people across 14 countries in a single morning. The USS Abraham Lincoln was one of the first major military assets to respond. Within 72 hours, it was operating off the coast of Sumatra. Its flight deck transformed from a combat platform into the largest humanitarian airbase in the region. Its helicopters flew around the clock, delivering food, water, and medical supplies to communities that had been completely cut off. Its distillation system produced 400,000 gallons of fresh water daily for survivors who had nothing. For many villages in Aceh province, the Abraham Lincoln wasn't a warship. It was the first sign that help was coming. Nobody builds a $12 billion warship planning for moments like that. But the same capabilities that make it devastating in combat, the aviation infrastructure, the logistical self-sufficiency, the ability to operate anywhere without external support, make it equally extraordinary in crisis response. Then came 2017. And the moment that demonstrated most clearly what the Abraham Lincoln's true purpose actually is. North Korea had been escalating its missile testing program through 2017 with a pace and boldness that alarmed the entire region. Intercontinental ballistic missile tests, nuclear weapon detonations, public threats against American territory. The situation had reached a tension level that serious analysts were describing as the closest the Korean Peninsula had come to open conflict in decades. The Abraham Lincoln Carrier Strike Group was ordered to the region. Within 48 hours of its arrival, North Korea canceled a scheduled missile test. No ultimatum was issued, no threatening statement was made, no shots were fired. The Abraham Lincoln simply appeared on intelligence reports. 100,000 tons of American engineering, 90 combat aircraft, a nuclear-powered strike group sitting in international waters within operational range, and the calculation in Pyongyang changed completely. This is the capability that never appears in budget hearings. The wars that don't happen, the missiles that don't launch, the crises that quietly de-escalate because someone looked at a satellite image and decided that today was not the day. Now imagine you are one of the pilots flying off that deck. It is 2 in the morning. The ship is moving through open ocean at 25 knots. The flight deck is lit only by red and white lights that turn the entire surface into something resembling a fever dream. You are strapped into an FA-18 Super Hornet, loaded with weapons, fuel, and enough electronic systems to fill a small office building. The catapult officer gives you the signal. You push your throttle to full afterburner. The noise is physical, not sound you hear, but pressure you feel in your chest cavity. And then the catapult fires. In 2 seconds, you go from sitting still on a steel deck to flying through darkness over open ocean at 165 miles per hour. The acceleration compresses your body so hard that breathing requires conscious effort. And then suddenly the deck is gone, and there is nothing beneath you but black water and the sound of your own engines. Every naval aviator who has done this describes the same thing afterward. The landing is scarier. why nobody can build one, and what comes next. Every serious military power on Earth has spent the last 50 years trying to build what America has. China, Russia, Britain, France, India. Every nation that watched American carrier strike groups rewrite the outcomes of conflicts from Korea to Kosovo to Iraq understood the same fundamental truth. Whoever controls carrier power controls the oceans. And whoever controls the oceans controls the outcome of any serious military confrontation anywhere on the planet. They all tried. Some are still trying. And every single one of them has collided with the same three walls that America spent decades and hundreds of billions of dollars climbing. Walls that cannot be overcome with money alone, with political will alone, or even with stolen technology alone. Wall 1. The catapult problem. Launching a fully loaded combat aircraft from a carrier deck requires solving one of the most brutal engineering challenges in aerospace. You need to accelerate tens of thousands of pounds of aircraft and weapons from a standing start to flying speed in an extremely short distance. How you solve that problem determines everything about what kind of air force your carrier can operate. America solved it with the steam catapult system in the 1950s. And has spent 70 years refining it into the electromagnetic launch system now installed on the Gerald R. Ford class. This system can launch heavier aircraft more frequently with more precise energy control than any catapult ever built. China and Russia solved it differently. They built ski jump ramps, curved metal slopes at the bow of their carriers that use the aircraft's own momentum to gain altitude at launch. It's cheaper, it's simpler, and it is fundamentally structurally inferior. A ski jump carrier cannot launch aircraft carrying full fuel and full weapons loads simultaneously. The physics don't allow it. Pilots must choose, either carry maximum fuel and reduce weapons, or carry maximum weapons and reduce fuel. Every mission launched from a ski jump carrier is a compromise mission before the pilot even leaves the deck. China's most advanced carrier, the Fujian, unveiled with enormous national pride in 2022, is their first attempt at electromagnetic catapults, a technology America deployed operationally decades ago. China celebrated catching up to where America was in the 1970s. Wall 2. The nuclear propulsion gap. Only two nations on Earth operate nuclear-powered aircraft carriers: America with 11 and France with 1. That asymmetry is not accidental. It reflects a technological and industrial capability gap that has proven essentially impossible to close. Russia understood nuclear propulsion. They built nuclear submarines extensively throughout the Cold War, but their attempt to apply that knowledge to carrier operations never succeeded reliably. Their carriers ran on conventional power, meaning they needed fuel, meaning they needed port access, meaning their operational range and endurance were permanently constrained by logistics that American carriers simply don't face. China has not yet attempted a nuclear-powered carrier. Their current and planned vessels all run on conventional propulsion, which means every Chinese carrier, no matter how advanced its aircraft or weapon systems, is fundamentally dependent on a supply chain that can be tracked, predicted, and in a conflict scenario, interdicted. The Abraham Lincoln goes where it wants, when it wants, for as long as it wants. That is not a feature. That is the entire strategic point. Wall 3. The human wall. This is the wall that money absolutely cannot buy, and it is the highest of the three. Operating an aircraft carrier requires 7,500 people, performing thousands of specialized functions in perfect, coordinated synchronization, continuously, for months at a time, in conditions of genuine danger. The flight deck alone, where aircraft are launched and recovered in a continuous cycle of organized chaos, is statistically one of the most dangerous working environments on Earth in peacetime. Jet blast, spinning propellers, arresting wires under tension, live weapons, fuel lines, and moving aircraft in a space where a single miscommunication kills people. The knowledge required to manage that environment safely and effectively is not written in any manual. It lives in institutional memory. It is passed from experienced sailors to new ones, over decades of continuous operation, building a culture of carrier aviation that cannot be downloaded, cannot be purchased, and cannot be replicated in a short timeline, regardless of budget. America has been continuously operating aircraft carriers since 1922. 100 years of unbroken institutional knowledge, refined through every war, every crisis, every technological generation. China commissioned their first carrier in 2012. Russia has never successfully operated one at full capability for a sustained period. The gap between 100 years of experience and 10 years of experience is not closable in a decade. It is barely closable in a generation. Now, let's talk about the cautionary tales. Russia's Admiral Kuznetsov is the most embarrassing warship in the inventory of any major military power on Earth. Russia's only aircraft carrier has spent more time under repair than at sea. It requires a dedicated ocean-going tug to follow it everywhere it travels, because its engines are so unreliable that the Russian Navy doesn't trust it to complete a voyage without breaking down. During a refit in 2018, a floating dry dock supporting the Kuznetsov sank, dropping a 70-ton crane directly onto the carrier's flight deck, punching a hole through it. Russia's most powerful warship was damaged by its own repair facility. The Admiral Kuznetsov has conducted exactly 2 combat deployments in its entire operational life. During the Syrian campaign, its aircraft suffered multiple accidents, including 2 crashes attributed to arrestor wire failures. It returned to port having lost more aircraft to accidents than to enemy action. This is what a carrier program looks like, without the institutional foundation America spent a century building. Britain's Queen Elizabeth class and France's Charles de Gaulle represent genuine capability, well-engineered, professionally operated warships that their respective navies are rightly proud of. But context matters. The Queen Elizabeth carries approximately 36 F to 35B aircraft in standard configuration, roughly 40% of what the Abraham Lincoln embarks. The Charles de Gaulle, France's nuclear carrier, carries around 40 aircraft and displaces 42,000 tons, less than half the Abraham Lincoln's displacement. These are capable regional power projection tools. They are not supercarriers. The distinction matters enormously in a high-intensity conflict scenario. And while every rival nation is still trying to reach where America was, America has already moved further ahead. The Gerald R. Ford CVN-78 is the first of a new generation of American supercarriers that makes the Abraham Lincoln look like a prototype. Electromagnetic catapults, replacing steam systems, advanced arresting gear, redesigned flight deck, improving sortie generation rates by 25%, reduced crew requirements through automation, saving hundreds of millions in operational costs annually. Dual-band radar systems that see further and more clearly than anything previously installed on a surface vessel. The Ford class doesn't just continue American carrier dominance. It extends the technological lead by another generation, at the precise moment when rivals are celebrating finally approaching where America was 30 years ago. Here is the final truth about the USS Abraham Lincoln and everything it represents. Nations don't want to build carriers because carriers are impressive engineering achievements. They want to build carriers because carriers are the physical manifestation of a specific kind of power. The power to show up anywhere on Earth, uninvited, unstoppable, and completely self-sufficient, and fundamentally alter the strategic reality of any situation simply by being present. America has 11 of them. The rest of the world combined has a fraction of that capability. The Abraham Lincoln was commissioned in 1989. It has patrolled every ocean. It has launched wars and prevented them. It has delivered bombs in fresh water with equal precision. It has made dictators recalculate and survivors believe that help was coming. For 35 years, it has been the most powerful conventional military instrument ever placed in the hands of a single nation. And the ship that replaces it will be even more so.